Hello and welcome to CivilNet. I'm here with my guest, Christopher Nurse. He's an expert on mining law and founder and director of the Hart Group. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Pleasure.
So you're here visiting from the UK to support Armenia's implementation of an international mining standard called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Could you start off by explaining what this standard is?
Yes, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, or we call it EITI, is a standard that's been around since around 2002 in various forms, and it's been developed in order to improve transparency, as it says, in this extractive sector. So that means mining, oil and gas, and it can be expanded into other areas as well. So some countries have decided to talk about water or forestry, depending on their local interests. What the standard is originally designed to do is to improve transparency of payments and receipts. So in other words, the participants in the initiative publish reports each year showing what the government has received in terms of receipts from the extractive sector, and this is confirmed by companies who say what they've paid. That's the core of the initiative.
Right. And to date, 52 countries are members of EITI, and in March of this year, Armenia became a candidate to join. Can you talk specifically about what joining entails, what changes or processes need to be implemented?
Basically, joining is dependent on the government giving a commitment to the principles of EITI, and there are principles set out in the standard. They're fairly high level, but what they mean is that the government is committed to improving the transparency in the sector, and it's usually a response to the country's population, civil society, taking an initiative and saying, we really need to understand better what's going on. Mining, or whatever the sector is relatively untransparent. We don't understand what it is. Can you tell us more about it? And the government is making a response to that.
And could you talk specifically, you're in Armenia for just a few days, could you talk specifically about what you'll be doing here during the duration of your trip?
Yes, I'm here with the support from the British Embassy in Yerevan, and we're working with the American University in Armenia, the Center for Responsible Mining, and we are helping the multi-stakeholder group of the EITI to do a review of the legal and institutional aspects of the mining sector in Armenia, with a view to recommending how it needs to be changed, if it indeed does need to be changed, to comply with the requirements of EITI and to do the wider agenda which the multi-stakeholder group would like to implement.
Right. And in Armenia, the mining industry is one of the largest sectors with major contributions to the economy. I wanted to ask you, kind of speaking more generally, how governments can balance the economic benefits that come from mining with the environmental impacts?
That's a really difficult question, if I may say so. It is obviously necessary to make a balance, but it is a balance between having a mining sector which produces an economic benefit to the country, produces employment, and on the other hand, also inevitably has some impacts on the environment. So the impacts on the environment need to be managed. There needs to be proper inspection systems, there need to be proper standards, which will ensure that nothing catastrophic happens, and that the emissions and the impacts from the mining operation, and I would say including the processing operations that are associated with mining, don't have a serious adverse impact on the local population. But that is a judgment that needs to be made locally. And
Right.
It's not going to be the same for Armenia as it is for other countries.
Right. And would you say that it's primarily the responsibility of the government to make those changes that would benefit the environment, or the responsibility of individual stakeholders involved in various extractive industries?
Well, of course, all stakeholders have an engagement with
Right.
it. And it is, I think, the responsibility of the government to see that the framework exists within which mining can be responsible. But it's also the responsibility of the mining companies to adhere to the framework and to do what they say they're going to do, to comply with the local legislation and to make the contributions to the local community that they have committed to at the time that they initially receive a mining license. I think the role of civil society is particularly important here because civil society is the third member of the multi-stakeholder group. I mentioned it earlier. It consists of the government, the companies and civil society representatives. And all three groups are working together on the initiative. And so it's a very holistic and rounded initiative. And the civil society groups are really taking the lead in Armenia in putting the spotlight on the responsible mining aspects of this. Which I think most mining companies would say, yes, we want to be responsible. And there's a question of how you define that. What does the local population believe responsible actually means? And that's something that we're working on at the moment. We're really at the start of our work. So we're looking at the current situation, what are the current laws, what are the current institutional arrangements. And there will be work later, in particular involving the World Bank, where there will be some studies, I think starting probably next year, to do a more in-depth analysis of some of these issues.
And you mentioned the importance of civil society organizations. In other country contexts that you're familiar with and have worked in, how can these organizations and also just citizens put pressure to change practices of within the mining industry?
Well, the citizens can work through organizations or they can work individually, and there's no impediment to that. Hopefully in the country people are able to speak up and to make their opinions known. And the same applies to the organizations. So some of the organizations are participating in the multi-stakeholder group, others are not, but in any case there is what's called the constituency of civil society organizations. So the ones that are on the multi-stakeholder group and participate actively in the conversations are in a sense representative of the wider sector. The stakeholder group is the forum within which the agenda for the EITI is set, and it's also the forum within which discussions take place about how the initiative should be implemented, what are particular concerns in Armenia, how are we going to address them.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that EITI aims to change kind of financial and tax transparency, not so much the processes. Can you expand on that point a little bit more, you know, how it goes about increasing that transparency?
Yes, one of the core elements of the EITI is the publication of an annual report. And in that report, you should see the monies received by the government in a particular year. So let's take a fiscal year. Probably we'll start with 2017, something like that. That's under discussion. And you'll see a report which says the company has paid certain amounts in terms of royalties, in terms of profit tax, maybe other streams as well. That's yet to be decided. And the government received this, and there'll be an independent administrator appointed whose job will be to look at the records and make sure that the numbers tie up. In other words, that you haven't had money go astray. That's one element of it, but the most important element is that in the report there'll be an overview of the sector, and it should be possible for anybody in the country to pick up this report on the internet, or maybe hard copies will be available as well, and to look at it and get an understanding of the significance of the sector in the context of the Armenian economy. And how much money did the government actually receive? And then maybe even to start asking questions, how is the government accountable for what it receives? How does this impact the general public finances? Questions like that.
Great. I think that does it for our discussion today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you for watching CivilNet.